Hello and welcome to this webinar organized by the Palestinian Return Centre. My name is Nassim Ahmed and I will be your host for this webinar. We will have a wonderful guest, Professor Michael Lynk. We will be discussing his report, his last report to the United Nations, and lots more. We will also be giving our audiences an opportunity to speak and ask questions to Professor Lynk, and discuss wider issues regarding the Palestinian question. It is, of course, a very sad day for the Palestinians following the brutal murder of Shireen, Palestinian journalist. It once again highlights the brutal nature of the Israeli occupation and also the complete impunity which it enjoys in the international community. I think these are themes which no doubt we will be touching upon throughout our conversation, by myself and of course you as well. I want to introduce Professor Lynk. I don't think he needs much by way of introduction. You know, he is one of the most eminent person in the world with regards to international law and the Palestinian issue. Be that as it may, I want to say that, he's a professor at Western University, London, Ontario, Canada. He served as Associate Dean of the faculty between 2008 and 2011. Professor Lynk teaches and writes in the area of labor law, human rights law, and constitutional law. From 2016, he was the United Nations Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur on Palestine in the occupied territories. And he ended his mandate for the UN in his previous position just last month. And in his capacity, he delivered regular reports to the General Assembly, to the Human Rights Council on the nature of the occupation in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. I think Professor Lynk will speak for about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, and then I will, we'll enter into conversation. I'll ask him some questions and also give you the opportunity to ask questions, and hopefully we can finish before 8 o'clock. So with that, Professor Lynk, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this, and thank you to the Palestine Return Centre for inviting me for this occasion to be able to speak about my report. As you mentioned, I ended my mandate and my duties as Special Rapporteur at the end of April, and the Human Rights Council has chosen a brilliant Italian human rights legal expert, Francesca Albanese, to be my successor. She began on the 1st of May. And she will be doing all the things that I was doing in terms of delivering annual reports to the Human Rights Council in Geneva and the General Assembly in New York, as well as issuing regular statements and composing letters to diplomatically and politically to decision makers who are involved in the issue of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. If I can speak for a few minutes with respect to my last report, which was issued in late March of 2022 to the to the Human Rights Council. In that report, I addressed the question of whether or not apartheid exists in the occupied Palestinian territory, that is, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. When I was first appointed in 2016 as Special Rapporteur, I had no intention of wanting to address the question of apartheid. I must confess, I thought that it would make it difficult for me to be able to speak with political and diplomatic decision makers on this issue. It seemed to me that there was lots of room within international humanitarian law and international human rights law that needed to be explored with respect to this occupation. And if I could write good reports on the questions of the legality of settlements, on the legality of annexation, on the accountability responsibilities of the international community towards Israel and Palestine, and look at some of the specific aspects of the occupation, such as the right to development, the right to health, the right to water and natural resources, the prohibition against collective punishment. All those sorts of issues, I thought it would help in moving the needle forward, that would bring a more speedy end to the occupation and the realization of Palestinian self-determination. So after about 4 years in this position, I began to realize that whatever quality of reports I was issuing, whatever nature of topics that I was focusing upon, however many speeches or editorials or writings I would do on this, there didn't seem to be much of an appetite by the international community to fulfill its accountability responsibilities and pressure Israel to bring this to an end. But it also struck me that the issue of a 55-year-old occupation, that this is becoming a legal oxymoron. To have a forever occupation is contrary to all of the founding principles of the Fourth Geneva Convention and international humanitarian law, which governs occupations. Occupations are supposed to be temporary and short-term. Occupations are supposed to be where the occupying power is supposed to administer the occupation in the best interests of the people under occupation, in this case, the Palestinians. An occupying power is supposed to rule consistent with international law and directions coming from the resolutions of the United Nations, and the occupying power acquires absolutely no right to annex any form of territory, of the occupied territory. And yet none of these four primary principles and tenets governing occupation were being obeyed by Israel. And the international community, particularly the West, Europe, and North America, showed a remarkable passivity in wanting to confront Israel with this. They occasionally would support resolutions at the Security Council, at the Human Rights Council, and the General Assembly that were critical of Israel's occupation, but they would take no steps whatsoever to hold Israel accountable. Criticism without consequences is meaningless in a situation like this. And if the international community is allowing a member state to go rogue with respect to defying international law, well, then the international community is going rogue itself with regards to this. International law is very clear on a large number of issues that are central to the occupation. One, annexation is profoundly illegal. And the Security Council has said this on, I believe, 11 occasions since 1967. The acquisition of territory, of occupied territory by force or by war is impermissible. The settlements that Israel has created, 300 settlements, and with over 700,000 settlers in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, are profoundly illegal. This has been said on repeated occasions by the Security Council, the highest decision-making body in our international system, most recently in December 2016, when the Security Council passed Resolution 2334, which said that the Israeli settlements are, and I quote, a flagrant violation under international law. And in that same resolution, Resolution 2334, which was passed in the waning weeks of the Obama administration by the Security Council asked the Secretary General of the United Nations to issue a quarterly report that would, to the Security Council, that would say, is Israel obeying the direction of the international community in Resolution 2334, that it absolutely and unconditionally halt all settlement activity. And there's another part of Resolution 2334 that says that the international community is supposed to distinguish between Israel and the territories it's occupied since 1967. So in the 21 quarterly reports that have been issued by the Secretary General or by his designee, the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, in the 21 reports issued to the Security Council 4 times a year since the beginning of 2017, the reports have said to the Security Council, Israel's taken no steps whatsoever to unconditionally halt settlement activity, and the international community has taken no steps to distinguish between Israel and the territories it has been occupying since 1967. it's hard to draw any other conclusion than the international community, and when I say that, I'm meaning particularly Europe and North America, are giving permission to Israel to continue to deepen its occupation and to entrench its settlements, because the settlements, after all, are the engine of the occupation. If there were no settlements and there were no Israeli settlers in the occupied territories, there'd be little rationale to continue with this occupation. So I asked myself, in approaching my 12th and final report, have we moved beyond the concept of occupation? Or, put another way, is the concept of occupation now inadequate to describe legally and politically what is happening on the ground in the occupied territory? And I came to the conclusion that it was. I came to the conclusion in my last report that this occupation had now become indistinguishable from annexation, indistinguishable from apartheid. And in saying that, and if I can take a few minutes just to describe how I came to that conclusion in my 12th and final report, what I did was utilize the legal definition of apartheid that can be found in the 1973 International Convention on the Suppression of the Crime of Apartheid and the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And both of those international documents offer definitions of apartheid, which are slightly different in secondary parts, but they wind up, I think, giving us a when you put together, they can be combined to be able to create a meaningful and accurate approach towards creating an analysis and a framework to determine whether apartheid exists in any particular case. So the three parts of the test are these, and I don't want to get too lawyerly with you, but I think it helps to understand this. The first question that you'd ask yourself is there an institutionalized regime of systematic racial oppression and discrimination in any particular situation? And in these circumstances, I concluded that yes, there was. That the 700,000 Israeli Jews living in the Jewish-only settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank have a vastly superior range of political, legal, and economic rights that are not enjoyed by the 3 million plus Palestinians living in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. They live together in one geographic area under one regime, the Israeli regime, but which winds up differentiating its distribution of rights and benefits as to whether or not you're an Israeli Jew or a Palestinian Arab. The Palestinian Authority, of course, exercises some restricted jurisdiction in this area, but its powers in the West Bank are really limited to municipal powers in the cities in the surrounding countryside that it controls, from Jenin in the north to Hebron in the south. The overriding them is the Israeli military control, and you can draw the conclusion that the poorest Jewish settlement in the occupied territories has considerably more economic, political, and legal rights than the most well-off Palestinian community in that same geographic area. The differences in living conditions, the differences in legal rights, the differences in citizenship rights between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs in East Jerusalem and the West Bank are stark, they're deeply discriminatory, and they're maintained through systematic and institutionalized oppression. So that's the first part of the definition. The second part is, was this form of alien rule, this domination of one racial, ethnic, national group over another, was it established with the intent to maintain this superiority? And again, after looking at the facts, I came to the conclusion that it did. If you examine statements by Israeli leaders, past and present, they have said consistently that they intend to retain control over all of the territory between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River in order to be able to enlarge the blocks of land available for present and future Jewish settlement, while continuing to confine the Palestinians into smaller and smaller barricaded areas of land. And this is a two-sided coin. On the one hand, Israel's plans for more Jewish settlers and more Jewish settlements on greater tracts of occupied land cannot occur without the expropriation of more Palestinian territory, together with harsher and more sophisticated methods of population control to manage the inevitable resistance. Under this system, the freedoms of one group are inevitably bound up very tightly with the subjugation of the other. And the third and final part of the definition is whether the system of institutionalized discrimination has been built upon the regular practice of inhumane acts. And there are definitions in both the 1973 Convention on Apartheid and the 1998 Rome Statute as to what constitutes inhumane acts. Some of them would include the following, which are very much present in the daily life of the occupation. There's arbitrary and extrajudicial killings, torture, violent deaths of children, the denial of fundamental human rights, a fundamentally flawed military court system which only tries Palestinian Arabs and in a manner and with much fewer rights than the court systems that Israeli Jewish settlers would have access to, arbitrary detention, collective punishment, and the segregated labor markets. The repetition of these acts over long periods of time, and their endorsement both by the Israeli Knesset and by the Israeli judicial system indicates these inhumane acts are not the result of random and isolated and unintended acts, but they're integral to Israel's system of rule. All of which means, when we take a look at this, is that in order to be able to sustain its occupation, and in order to be able to deepen and entrench its method of military rule, and to be able to continue to expand the settlements, expand settler roads, expand army firing zones, and so on, the level of violence that Israel needs in order to be able to sustain this occupation is growing ever deeper. 2021 marked the highest number of Palestinian deaths by Israeli violence since 2014. 2021 marked the largest number of settler attacks on Palestinians and their property since statistics first began to be kept back, I believe, around 2012. The statistics for the first 4 months of 2022 show no sign of diminishing these tragic statistics. So all in all, I came to the conclusion that this is apartheid in the occupied territories. I want to point out that there have been a series of other reports issued by Israeli, Palestinian, and international human rights groups over the last 2 years, all of which concluded that apartheid exists either in the West Bank or in the entire territory controlled by Israel between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Palestinian groups such as Al-Haq and Al-Mizan and Adamir have come to the conclusion that there is apartheid. Israeli human rights groups such as B'Tselem and Yashdin have drawn the same conclusions, as have the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. And there's recently an excellent report issued by the Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Clinic that also concluded that this is apartheid as well. So all of a sudden, while Palestinians have been raising the issue of the existence of apartheid for a number of years, it has now become part of the international human rights conversation that apartheid winds up existing. Now, apartheid, to be clear, our comparison point are those two international conventions that I spoke about. This is not to say that apartheid exists in the occupied territories is not saying that that apartheid is identical to what occurred in southern Africa between the 1940s and the 1980s. There are some parts of apartheid in South Africa, for example, that don't exist in the Palestinian territories, the so-called petty or petite apartheid, these separate benches for Black South Africans and white South Africans, the separate elevators, the separate staircases, the separate entrances to buildings, the separate water coolers. But on the other hand, there are features of apartheid in the occupied territory that are actually would appear to be much harsher than anything that ever existed in apartheid in southern Africa in its heyday, such as segregated highways, or high walls and extensive checkpoints, or barricading significant parts of the population, or the missile strikes and tank shelling of a civilian population, or the abandonment of the Palestinian social welfare to the international community. I concluded my report that with the eyes of the international community wide open, Israel has imposed upon Palestine an apartheid reality in a post-apartheid world. So that's the summary of what I've done, and I'll invite Nazim to be able to ask me any questions that he has, and certainly any questions that the audience might have.
Yep, thank you, Professor. It was, I think, a fantastic summary of your report, and I highly encourage everyone tuning in to read the entire report. It's not too long, and it's actually a very good summary also of the many other reports published by, as you mentioned, the various international human rights group. You began, interestingly, talking about how you arrived at the question of whether Israel is an apartheid state, Israel is practicing apartheid or not. We need to get that formulation right. And I think that journey itself is very, very interesting. And how you are facing, as you said, a brick wall when it comes to presenting your reports to the United Nations, and there was remarkable passivity with regards to the United Nations, major UN powers, and ultimately you arrived at the conclusion in your final 12th report that Israel is practicing apartheid, and you offered 3 tests whether to check. And I think those 3 tests are very interesting in itself, whether Israel is whether there is an institutional regime practicing apartheid, and you said that there is an institutional regime. Was there a form of rule established with the intent of establishing apartheid? And there again, you said there is a intent there to establish racial superiority of one group over another group, and also was the system of domination or system of racial domination built upon inhumane acts? And in all 3 of these tests, you conclude in your report that Israel is practicing all the features that constitute a regime of apartheid. And I think that's very, it's what many of us suspected for many, many decades. But my question to yourself and others who come to that conclusion is the timing. You spoke about the journey. Why at that moment? Because many Palestinians previously have written reports suggesting that Israel is practicing apartheid. Was the change in the timing really the various other reports like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, or was this really your personal journey which you undertook? What was the actual moment when you said, no, this is not working? I mean, this is not the framework of occupation, the framework of 2 states and international law, which you've been mandated to actually research and observe and document, is not really working. There's something bigger going on, which is that there's actually an apartheid regime, and the Western governments are actually supporting this and encouraging this. What was the timing actually?
What was the timing? Well, I'll tell you, it depended on a couple of things. One was the fact these reports started to come out, and of course, I was reading each of them very carefully. The first report came out almost 2 years ago in June 2020, issued by Yashdin, which looked at the question of whether or not apartheid exists in the West Bank. That was the geographic focus and boundary. And that started the conversation rolling. And then 6 months later, in early 2021, B'Tselem had issued a relatively short report saying, well, it's actually Jewish supremacy from the Mediterranean to the river, to the Jordan River, and that because they looked at a wider geographic area, it opened up a much more interesting and invigorating debate about apartheid. And then Human Rights Watch, about this time last year, I think in late April, the Palestinian organizations, including Al-Haq and Al-Mizan, were issuing their own reports saying this is apartheid, all of which I read, all of which I found utterly persuasive, and none of which I could find serious problems in. The Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, among others, said, and B'Tselem said it's apartheid throughout, and they said it's impossible, if you like, to be able to say it's democracy here and apartheid there. That if the occupation is organically linked to the policies and practices and laws of Israel, and there's discrimination against Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, you have to look at it as one cohesive whole, both in terms of its practice and in terms of what the country is doing. Now, that's beyond my mandate. My mandate is only the occupied Palestinian territories, but certainly I acknowledge the depth of factual reporting that were contained in these reports. I certainly recognize the sophisticated legal analysis that they provided, and their conclusions, to me, while you could quibble here and there with some small aspect of it, they seem to me to be irrefutable and virtually unanswerable with respect to that. I also want to point out, Nassim, that it's not only these NGOs are saying this, and now myself, and I do want to pay actually homage to one of my predecessors, Richard Falk. He issued a report together with Dr. Virginia Tilley back in 2017, published by the Economic and Social Council of West Asia, a UN agency headquartered in Beirut, where they concluded it was apartheid as well. And that report, I think, lasted 48 hours on the UN website. And comments made sometime later by the then American ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, said that as soon as that report came out, she said, the shortest period of time known to humankind, I was on the phone to the UN Secretary General and demanded that this report be taken down. And indeed, the Secretary General's office ordered that the report be removed from the UN website, claiming that the report hadn't been properly run by his office, when there was that was never a part of the process of approving that particular report. And in response, the director, the UN director of ESCWA, that UN agency that released the report, then resigned in protest. So the conversation has been going on over the last 5 years. But I want to mention that Ban Ki-moon wrote a remarkable op-ed in the Financial Times at the end of June 2021, where he said that Israel's de facto annexation policies have resulted in a situation where the prospects of a two-state solution have all but vanished. And then he went on to say that the Israel's structural domination and oppression of the Palestinians through this indefinite occupation and this dual legal system of a full benefit of citizenship rights to Israeli Jews living in the OPT, as opposed to no rights at all for the stateless Palestinians, this arguably constitutes apartheid, he said. And I also want to point out the fact that Michael Ben-Yair, the former Attorney General of Israel in the early and mid-1990s under Yitzhak Rabin, wrote a few months ago in 2022, he said, "It is with great sadness that I must conclude that my country has sunk to such political and moral depths that is now an apartheid regime. It is time for the international community to recognize this reality as well." He went on to say, "It is impossible to conclude otherwise. The occupation is a permanent reality. This is a one-state reality with two different peoples living with unequal rights." So, and I could quote more, but I think you get an idea that in a very short period of time, apartheid is entering into the international conversation. Of course, governments are resisting that. I point to the Dutch government, which said, and I think in a recent letter, that well, this has never been determined by a judicial court, therefore we can't say apartheid winds up existing, which I think is an excuse for them not to investigate themselves. My own government, the Canadian government, says this is not apartheid, but doesn't say why it disagrees or challenges the volumes of apartheid reports that have come out recently. So I think, the conversation is changing. Basically, this, if the international community, let me just say this to you, in 1980, the Security Council passed Resolution 476. This is the end of June 1980, 42 years ago. And in that resolution, Nassim, the Security Council said that, and I'll quote, that it reaffirms the overriding necessity of ending the prolonged occupation of the Arab territories occupied by Israel since 1967. And it also went on to say that it strongly deplores the continued refusal of Israel, the occupying power, to comply with the relevant resolutions being passed by the General Assembly and the Security Council. So here you have two things. They're already saying in 1980, this is a prolonged occupation that has to end. And secondly, they're saying that Israel is a bad faith occupier who's refusing to comply with the direction of the international community. That was 13 years after the occupation began. Now we're at a stage of 55 years after the occupation began. If the international community had taken its own resolutions and its own laws seriously in 1980, it could have brought an end to that occupation fairly rapidly. Israel is heavily dependent upon international trade, international diplomacy, and international economic relations with Europe and North America. If they'd taken their own laws seriously, that occupation could have ended. So I guess I'm saying, when I delivered my report to the Human Rights Council in March, I said, if you had done what you indicated you were intending to do with these resolutions you adopted at the Security Council in 1979 and 1980, there would have been a genuine Palestinian state very shortly afterwards, and nobody would be on the podium of the Human Rights Council in 2022 talking about apartheid. If apartheid exists now, it's because the international community, Europe and North America, has an extraordinary amount of responsibility for letting this occupation continue to deepen with no serious challenge to Israel.
There are a lot of those what-if moments when it comes to the Israel-Palestine questions throughout history, and if the international community did behave differently, we would not be seeing this exponential rise in Israeli aggression and entrenchment of the occupation. And I think you mentioning Canada's position on this, I think it's the case with many democracies in the West as well. They've all opposed the findings, but they never explain why. These are the same very organizations which they rely upon. I think Canada relies upon Human Rights Watch, Amnesty more than anyone else when it makes conclusions about other countries. But when it comes to Israel, there's a real reluctance to agree to the findings. I mean, I have a lot of questions, but I've also got a number of questions from the viewers, which I want to put to you, Professor. So I've got 3 at the moment, so I'll just, throw all them at your direction. Could you expand on the challenges you faced regarding Palestine whilst working as UN Special Rapporteur? Second one, how has UNRWA been affected during your time as UN Special Rapporteur? And the third one, what role do you see the UN having when it comes to Palestine in the foreseeable future?
Sure. Let me explain first that what it means to be a special rapporteur. I'm appointed by the UN Human Rights Council, as you mentioned. I'm the 7th special rapporteur on the issue of human rights in the Palestinian territory. And it's a voluntary unpaid position. I keep my day job as a Canadian law professor. And it means I have independence, if you like. I'm within the UN human rights system, but I'm autonomous from the Human Rights Council. I choose the topics within the boundaries of my own mandate. I choose the topics I want to write. I choose what I want to say with respect to this. So it allows me and allows my other 55 or so special rapporteurs on their own mandates a considerable amount of freedom to be able to look at this. And we're chosen because we're human rights experts with skills in understanding human rights law and how to apply it. So in terms of the challenges that I faced working on Palestine while working as a special rapporteur, it meant that I was able to have doors open for me to be able to speak in Geneva or New York at the UN or within particular European capitals at their foreign ministries. And they were polite. They received my reports. They received my commentary. I would always come with an ask or asks as to what they should be doing. And among anything else, I urged them, apartheid isn't the only A word that I would have raised. The big A word for me is accountability. And I wrote 2 of my 12 reports on the issue of accountability and the lack of meaningful actions being taken from Europe and North America. And I urged them, I said, end your military and arms relationship with Israel. Don't be signing free trade agreements with Israel. And if you do have them, I want you should be reviewing them, because you're giving Israel both, the military arms that it needs to continue this occupation, and you're giving it all the license to be able to have a flourishing European level style of economy. I said, at the very least, you should be enacting legislation that will ban settlement goods and products from entering into your marketplace. These 300 settlements, many of these settlements, some of these settlements are if you like, suburbs of Tel Aviv or suburbs of Jerusalem. But others of these have their own economy. They have industrial parks there. They have factories. They have wineries. And the goods that they wind up producing, some of which enters into the international marketplace. If the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which has been domesticated into the legislation of many European and North American countries, as a legislation with respect to war crimes and crimes against humanity, the Rome Statute says that a occupying power creating civilian settlements in occupied territory, that is a war crime, very clearly. If the settlements are war crimes, then how is it you're allowing the proceeds from crimes to be entering into your market and being sold as if there's no difference between Israel and its settlements in the occupied territory? You're in breach of what Resolution 2334 calls for from the Security Council, that there should be a distinction made between Israel and the settlements. So that was probably the biggest issue I wind up facing, is getting the attention of significant decision makers, particularly in Europe and North America, to take any of their responsibilities seriously. And I'm not saying that I would have had any great sway with respect to them, but if I look back on 6 years and say the occupation is more entrenched and deeper than ever than from the moment when I became Special Rapporteur in May 2016, and there seems to be less and less of an appetite by European and North American countries to do anything with respect to Israel, even as it builds more settlements, even as it adds 20 to 25,000 settlers per year into the OPT. I mean, who can't do their math and figure out that 20,000 settlers more a year in the occupied territories means no Palestinian state? The Israeli political leadership has moved well beyond a two-state solution. The facts on the ground have moved well beyond a two-state solution. And yet the European and North American foreign ministers keep on repeating the mantra of two-state solution, two-state solution. And that actually is Israel's sweet spot. The leadership itself knows that there's no more two-state solution because they've made it impossible. Yet as long as European and North American countries think a two-state solution is still somehow possible with all those settlers on the ground, that allows Israel the green light to continue to put more settlements and more settlers there. It couldn't ask for to be in a better position vis-a-vis the Palestinians. So that's probably the biggest challenge I wind up facing. The second question is, how has UNRWA been affected during my time as UN Special Rapporteur? UNRWA, for those who may not know, obviously, is the UN agency created in 1949 by the UN to care for the Palestinian refugees. And it exists, I think, on a three-year revolving mandate that's from the UN General Assembly. UNRWA's situation always precarious has gone from bad to worse, I'm afraid, during the time that I've been Special Rapporteur. Obviously, during the Trump administration, the Americans had provided around 30% of the funding for UNRWA. They cut it off entirely. The Biden administration has restored some of that, but not all of it. UNRWA, just like the Palestinian Authority itself, is in a continued state of fiscal crisis, where it does not have the funding available to deliver a basic level of education, health, and social services and housing to the Palestinian refugees that it cares for in Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. So its situation, I'm afraid, is getting worse, and there was over the last 20 to 25 years increased amounts of funding coming to UNRWA from Arab countries, particularly in the Gulf, and some of that seems to be now in doubt as well, as the Abraham Accords have come into effect, and there's a lot of daylight between the Palestinian Authority and some of the Gulf states that's affected funding going to UNRWA. And the third question was, what role do you see the UN having when it comes to Palestine in the foreseeable future? Well, what I often say is, on the one hand, the United Nations at its very best is the place where the question of Palestine is kept alive. There is a basket of resolutions every year at the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly that reaffirm all of the established rights that the Palestinian people have, including an end to the occupation and the right to self-determination. It pronounces on the illegality of a number of the Israeli practices, and it funds various work that specialized UN agencies perform in Palestine, including the World Health Organization, the International Labor Organization, the Office of the Coordinator for Humanitarian Affairs, and so on. So the UN at its very best is the place where Palestine can come. It can make its case for its independence, and where a majority of countries representing a vast majority of the world's population will wind up agreeing with them. The problem is that the UN is not often at its very best. Any action by the United Nations on political crises, including Israel and Palestine, ultimately is determined by the Security Council. And as long as the post-war arrangement of the 5 countries who have veto powers, and of course I'm particularly mentioning the United States, that is going to wind up hampering any ability of the international community and the United Nations to take decisive action with respect to Israel and its now illegal occupation. The United States, I think there's been something like 35 vetoes issued by the United States over the last 50 years with respect to Israel. It's the only country of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council that has ever issued a veto with respect to a proposed resolution regarding the Israeli occupation of Palestine. In his memoirs, Kofi Annan, I think the memoirs are called Interventions, and was published a decade ago in 2012. He said that he pointed a spotlight on the United States and said that its excessive possessiveness with respect to ensuring that any international efforts regarding Israel and Palestine have to go through Washington was a major reason as to why the question of Palestine remains unresolved and why the occupation continues to deepen. And he contrasted what he called was the alertness of the Security Council with respect to some of the issues going on during the civil war of the last decade in Syria, with what he thought was the unexplained and tragic passivity of the Security Council when it comes to the Israeli occupation of Palestine.
Yeah, you spoke about your role as a UN rapporteur, and the role of UN rapporteur in Palestine is not like any other one. It's a very, very, very difficult one, and we saw the smear and the character assassinations of your predecessors like Richard Falk, John Dugard, and no doubt your successor Francesca Albanese will also face similar campaigns against her character as well. And you also mentioned your journey, how you went from one place and came to the conclusion that no, the real question is apartheid. Let's look into that. But was there something in your 4 years that even surprised you, given what we know about the role of UN Rapporteur on Palestine? Is there something that surprised you, shocked you, because you were constantly refused entry into Israel? Is there something in the work that you've been doing you thought, wow, I didn't realize it's this bad?
Yeah.
Was there a moment like that?
Well, there probably were two, and they both have to do with Gaza. We all know that in 2018 was the Great March of Return, where thousands of almost entirely unarmed Palestinians would march towards the fence separating Gaza from Israel. And Israel employed hundreds of Israeli army snipers. And over 200 Palestinians were shot dead, almost all of them unarmed. Thousands were wounded, some of them for life, with these shootings. And there were, I think, more than 50 Palestinians shot on, I think it was May 14th, 2020, almost 2 years ago. And that was the same day that the Americans opened up their new embassy in Jerusalem. And I guess I thought to myself, wow, we've reached a turning point. Surely the world, surely the international community, surely Europe and North America has to be absolutely astonished and upset by this mass shooting of unarmed Palestinians. The plea has been from Europe, well, you'd find other ways of resisting besides using methods that some people regard as terrorist tactics. Here you have these thousands of Palestinians marching towards the fence, protesting the continued Israeli blockade of Gaza, demanding that, as 80% of the population in Gaza are refugees themselves, that the world do something. And yet, Frederick Engels once wrote about the revolution that arose in Europe in 1848, and he said something to the effect of, in 1848, history reached a turning point, and it didn't turn. And I thought about that, and that phrase echoed in my mind in 2020 during the Great March of Return, and I repeated that thought in May 2021, exactly a year ago, when that very intense 11-day violence by Israel on Gaza. And of course, I do condemn the rockets being fired by Hamas into Israeli population centers as well. But this shows you just how asymmetrical the levels of violence that are being employed there. 260 Palestinians died. I think it was roughly 12 Israelis or foreigners died as a result of Palestinian violence with respect to that. Since 2008, I believe that the Office of the UN Humanitarian Coordinator has estimated that slightly over 6,000 Palestinians have been killed, and roughly 270 Israelis have been killed by Palestinian violence. That's a ratio of over 22 to 1. And I'm not saying that ratio would be better if more Israelis would be killed. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying these are all deaths that don't need to happen, but they're inevitable in any relationship where there's structured discrimination and structured violence of a military rule over another people that doesn't want that rule. It's inevitable to wind up happening. There'll be forms of resistance, some of them peaceful, some of them unarmed, and some of them incredibly violent. And that's, I think, it demonstrates, exactly why the rates of death and the degrees of violence keep rising, and that Israel have to maintain or confront those rising levels of violence as it tries to continue to manage the occupation. What I hear from the international community is basically to Israel, we understand you've got a coalition government right now. We don't want to see Benjamin Netanyahu come back, so we'll avert our eyes to the continued settlement building, to the continued number of settlers that are arriving into the occupied territories. We will turn a deaf ear to when you say, as Naftali Bennett has said, I oppose a Palestinian state, and I'm doing everything I can in my power to oppose any return to the Oslo process. That all of that can wind up occurring, and the international community will allow it. Essentially, what's happening is you have Naftali Bennett as a Netanyahu without the drama and the bluster. He's a Netanyahu with manners.
He's actually more on the right of Netanyahu, isn't he?
He is. He's constrained by the array of coalition partners he has. But what you have are these small center and left Israeli Jewish parties, as well as the one Arab Palestinian party in the coalition, who are basically having to swallow what the right wants, which is more violence, deeper occupation, more settlement units, more settlements, and more settlers.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of defies logic when people tell Palestinians stop resisting or stop your violence. If the occupation is permanent, then resistance is permanent. That's just human nature. That's just how people behave. Change the perverse incentives, and behavior will change as well. I'm conscious of the time. We've only got 10 minutes, but I do, and I want to ask a question about the future and where your work and the amazing work you've done and others have done on Israel and apartheid. Where is that heading? We know there's an ICC investigation which was launched in 2021 last year. Would that also be looking into your findings, your reports, and also B'Tselem, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch? Is that something you're working with as well towards pushing, advancing your reports and your conclusions?
Sure.
So how does it all fit in with the ICC investigation into Israel war crimes?
Sure. Well, there's two bodies right now that are offering some forms of accountability. First is the International Criminal Court, which launched a preliminary investigation in 2015 following complaints once Palestine was able to receive a recognition as a state and therefore become a member of the International Criminal Court. So that preliminary investigation lasted until, I believe, March of 2021, when the then prosecutor of the ICC stated that she had acquired enough evidence to be able to go to the second stage, which is the formal investigation, and that's now being led under the direction of the new prosecutor at the ICC. The problem with this is that the sun rises slowly. It took 6 years for the preliminary investigation to wind up being completed. We're now into a little more than a year of the formal investigation. That may take 2, 3, or 4 years. The two main issues, they're not the only issues, but the two main issues being looked at the International Criminal Court is, number one, the wars in Gaza in 2014, 2018, the Great March of Return, and then the 2021 short intensive war.
Yeah.
So all of that is being investigated as whether or not that constitutes either war crimes or crimes against humanity. The second main area of investigation by the prosecutor's office is the settlements. And to me, I think that's low-hanging fruit. I mean, that is virtually a slam dunk. The language prohibiting occupying power putting its civilian population into occupied territory is absolutely clear in the Rome Statute, and that language is taken directly from the language prohibiting this in the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention. And as well, not to get too lawyerly on this, is the 1977 Additional Protocol 1 to the Fourth Geneva Convention, which said that an occupying power settling a civilian population into occupied territory is a grave breach of international humanitarian law and a war crime. So my sense is that Israel has absolutely no arguments with respect to this, and not that they'll probably show up at the International Criminal Court, but this is the thing that I think they fear the most, is that there'll be an active, thorough investigation of these various files that have been put before the prosecutor, and that at some point we'll reach the end of the formal investigation stage in a couple of years, and then the decision will be made as to whether or not to formally press charges against Israelis, individual Israelis, probably cabinet ministers or military commanders or settlement leaders. And the third stage would actually be the establishment of charges before the International Criminal Court and a trial with respect to this. The second area is something I think you were alluding to, is that in 2021, the Human Rights Council created a permanent commission of inquiry to look into the root causes with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in all its forms. And it's not simply limited to the occupied Palestinian territory. It also covers a much broader geographic area, which would include Israel and would also include, obviously, the question of Palestinian refugees as well. This commission of inquiry has three very distinguished commissioners who are leading this. Neva Pillay, who was the former High Commissioner for Human Rights and a former judge in South Africa, an Indian jurist, and a human rights expert from Australia are the three commissioners. They will probably issue a report, I'm expecting sometime in July, to the Human Rights Council, would be their first report. But I think, I don't know in detail what their work is, but I suspect they're probably planning to have already mapping out what their immediate and intermediate steps are going to be taking in terms of what questions they want to examine, where best to devote their resources, and what reports and what topics they're going to be addressing over the next couple of years. So those are the two main areas where there are some accountability measures, and I've got to say, obviously, those accountability measures are either been opposed or no support was given to them by either the United States, by Europe, or any other major Western countries. The claim is Palestinians should not use armed resistance. They should come to the negotiating table and they should use only legal methods. Well, when the Palestinians use legal methods or diplomatic methods,
BDS, for example.
Yeah, precisely. They wind up being punished for that or lobbied very strongly against being able to do that.
Yes. What I was going to add was you mentioned the investigation into illegal settlements. But would they, I'm just wondering, you're an expert, of course, on this. When looking into illegal settlements, is there a possibility where they may look at settlements as part of a much broader apartheid system? Is that an avenue which they could look into, or simply say, we know illegal settlements are wrong and everyone knows that, but is there a possibility that they could say the settlements are actually part of a much broader apartheid system?
Yes, and that would be inescapable. I think what you can do is take a look at very specific aspects of the occupation. Annexation is illegal. The settlements are illegal. The location of the wall is illegal. The pattern of human rights violations are illegal, and see that as the natural occurrence of what has now become, in my view, an illegal occupation. But you can also put them all together, as I've done in my report, and as all these other organizations have done in their reports, and say, all of these aspects contribute to a bottom line analysis that this is apartheid, and starting with the settlements, because the settlements are, if you like, the clearest visual evidence of apartheid, where you have 300 communities set up illegally in occupied territory, only admitting Israeli Jews, giving them full citizenship rights, giving them extraordinary financial benefits, giving them obviously all their political and civic rights as well, while in the same geographic territory, under the same rule by the same jurisdiction, i.e. Israel, you have 3 million Palestinians watching their land being expropriated, who have no voting rights over the regime that controls them, who live in various degrees of immiserization because of the invasion of their natural resources, their inability to be able to have a functional economy absent international injections of aid and funding. The settlements are at the very core. They're the engine of the occupation, and they are probably exhibit number one with respect to the fact this is apartheid.
Thank you, Professor Lynk. We've run out of time, and it's been wonderful talking to you. I hope those who have tuned in have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation as well. I hope to speak to you again soon in another conversation, in not too long, far away. So hope you get better. I know you seem like you have a cold. Hope you recover soon, or is it just hay fever? I'm not sure what it is.
I hope that's all it is a spring cold, Nassim. But thank you very much to you and to the center for inviting me to speak today. It was a great pleasure to be here.
Oh, thank you, and see you soon. And you at home who've tuned in, thank you very much, and bye bye.